and gentlemen, Jonathan Pershing, Deputy Director, Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis, United States Department of Energy.
So thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's hard to follow a panel like that. David did a fabulous job, and the panelists were all incredibly well informed and on things you guys are all really focused on. But I've been asked to speak about a couple of, really only one thing, which I wanted to take about 10 minutes of your time to introduce. We're in the midst at the Department of Energy in launching a Quadrennial Energy Review. And you guys may have heard a bit about it, and I thought I'd spend about 5 minutes in telling you about it, and then 5 minutes with questions before you move on to the next part of your discussions. So the intent with this exercise is to think a little bit about some of the large questions facing the energy sector. And I think David and the entire panel that just finished provided some of that insight. Hopefully we can add a bit more to it and do it in a more formalized fashion. But the intent behind this is to look really at U.S. energy infrastructure and to begin in this first year with a review of transmission, storage, and distribution. And as we look at that, the rationale, I think, is fairly clear. If we think about the energy systems and the energy infrastructure that we've got, it is aging. It no longer does as good a job as we want in delivering the services that we want. It is facing a series of significant, let's call them constraints and barriers. 60% of the people who work in the energy system are expected to retire in the next decade. You start thinking through the consequences of that and what are the implications for our structure. You think about the new technologies that we've got, things like smart grid, which was the focus of the last discussion, or one of the ideas that came out in that last discussion. We're not currently designed to take that on board very easily. But we've also got a whole set of new opportunities. We've got massive new supplies of resources. You think about the gas infrastructure, the oil infrastructure. In that context, these are things we weren't talking about in quite the same way as little as a decade ago, perhaps as little as 5 years ago. So you start thinking through the changes in that system and where it plays out, and we're in a very, very different world. But we've also got outside constraints. We've got the consequence of climate change, things that are looming in terms of long-term frameworks and where we go. Those have to be taken into account. We have opportunities, but also constraints on competitiveness. Who will manufacture the systems and the various kinds of infrastructure components that will drive that vision of the future? What do the various competitive things look like? How do we deal with the existing set of storms and weaknesses and frailties that have knocked out systems? Many of you who are visiting Washington may have heard on this morning's news that, in fact, if you're in certain parts of the northwest of the city, you have to boil your water the next couple of days because the power went out and the filtration system went down. So it's actually not a water problem, it's a power problem. You start thinking about those, that's not a function of climate, it's a function of an aging infrastructure which is no longer adequate to the task that we ask of it. In that context, we've got three large goals that we're working on. One is to take a look at energy security. That will take the form of physical security as well as economic and cybersecurity. Two is a question of economic competitiveness. How do we think about that in the context of both what the system delivers for the economy as well as the narrow economics of the system, the jobs that are attached to the energy sector? And three, the climate change components. In particular, more widely, environment, but the focus is a bit on climate. As we think about infrastructure and its long-lived lifetime, in that context, we expect those impacts to become more severe over the lifetime of the equipment that we're now manufacturing. Under each one of these, there are characteristics that you can use to better identify what you do. Is the system resilient? Does it manage disaster and recover quickly? Is it robust? Does it deal with adverse circumstances? Some you may not project, some you could currently predict. Does it deal with scalability? Can you take models from one place and apply them in other parts of the country? How does it deal with affordability? Is the price high enough that you can't do it? Too high that you can do it reasonably? How do you think about reasonable cost in where the system works? Take that set of characteristics, look at the existing institutions, look at the arrangements, and then move from there to doing a series of analyses. The analyses looking both at what those weaknesses are and how they intersect. So not merely a vertical slice into the oil sector, but looking at the links between oil and electricity. Not merely a vertical discussion of what's the new deal on renewable energy, but how does that tie back to gas and the demand for backstop supply and power. Those intersections being part of an analysis. And then look at a series of scenarios. Scenarios that might look at a high and a low gas price. scenarios that might look at a more or a less rapid penetration of new technologies, scenarios that might look at a high and a low effort on climate change. And take that and wrap it up and then look at what policy implications that yields. What are the options that we've got? How do we think about where we move next? And then make some recommendations on that basis. The audience is quite large. Unlike many other reviews of this sort that other agencies have done, the Department of Energy is only one of a group of actors in the energy space. The commissioners who've been here during the day, you, the states more widely, other federal agencies, including the private sector, a fundamentally different role, for example, than in a quadrennial defense review, where the client and the agency doing the work is the Department of Defense. Or even a technology review, which the Department of Energy undertook a couple of years back, where we were, in fact, one of the major clients. What research ought we as an agency to be supporting in the energy technology space? This is one that's opened much more widely. And it's therefore no surprise that it is being run not by the Energy Department, but by the White House. We are the secretariat for it, but it's being co-chaired jointly by the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the Domestic Policy Council. We're serving as a secretariat, as a convener, as an analyzer, but it will be an interagency group. The Department of Agriculture, for example, with the rural electrification programs, is fundamentally a major player in this space. FERC, while we won't be able to use them quite the same way because they're a regulatory agency, nonetheless a major player in this space. If we look at the Department of Interior and choices about siting for new facilities, a major player in these arenas. The intent is to do an interagency process, but then to reach out much more widely and to have a series of stakeholder meetings around the country that will be open, inviting feedback, inviting comment, and then iterating with the public community as we go forward and work on this report. The first report is, as I mentioned, transmission, distribution, and storage. Intent is to have that available by the end of the calendar year. Next year, the intent currently is to do the other two ends, both generation and production, so it includes oil, gas, as well as power, and then end use across all of the end use sectors. And between those 2 years, we then have a more composite review of the energy system and the infrastructure writ more wide. At the end of the day, it's quite clear to us in the Energy Department that this is a point where the system is in flux. Choices we make now, institutions that we have now, systems that we have now, and choices we make about each of those will influence the entirety of the energy sector for decades to come. It's an unusual point in time. Everything is kind of open. Opportunities are there. Choices, good ones will have good outcomes. Bad ones, quite clearly, more negative consequences. And our effort with this exercise is about how we in the government and the larger community can make those choices that yield a better long-term outcome. Focus at the end, a period around 2030, 15 years out. Things that are not immediate. You're not looking at tomorrow's problem. You're not looking at the next pipeline. You're looking at the system. And how do you think about investment and opportunity and constraints in the system? And overall, that's a period I think that we all have a lot of reason to evaluate and to consider. That's a point in time that I think is going to matter a lot to the country in terms of what kind of energy structure we've got. Pipes, wires, rail, it's all in this particular mix. Next will be obviously the end use and the production side. So let me stop with that and see if there are questions about where we are. This was meant to be a very brief interlude between your previous discussion and some of your wrap-up work. So happy to take some questions if people have any.
Hi, this is Patty Duran with the Smart Grid Consumer Collaborative. Could you review those last two or three goals that you have for what's happening next year and the year after? And then where does the consumer fit in there? Consumer research, engagement, or education, or if the consumer is in there?
So the piece is divided into two parts. The first part is looking at the infrastructure of transmission, distribution, and storage. And that piece obviously crosses a wide variety. So we're looking at kind of the easy way to think about it is pipes, wires, and rail. It's a little bit broader than that. We'll take a look at some of the barge traffic and the consequences for coal movement and some of the biofuels things that move on rail and trucks. So it's a little bit broader, but that's the kind of a shorthand, gives you a pretty good sense of the focus. Next year, the intent is to look at both other ends of the spectrum. Before you get to transmission, you obviously have generation. Once you finish distribution, you obviously have the end user. And the intent is to look at the infrastructure at those two ends in next year's report. Composite between the two, a more holistic and comprehensive view of the energy infrastructure that we've got and where the barriers are and where the opportunities are going forward. With regard to the question about consumers, the answer is that ultimately they're who manages to deal with both ends of this, right? At one point, the consumer is the individual user. A lot of their interface is at the end of the efficiency side or the appliance side or the vehicle itself. But they have an interest in getting the information and understanding how the system works between the point where it's generated and the point where it gets to them. I've been struck by the kind of political and press reporting that we've seen in the context of not just today's Washington debacle with the power and the water, but what happened in New York when we had Sandy, or what happened in California when they had a series of forest fires that ended up truncating lines, and Gray Davis calls a state of emergency in order to manage the consequences of potential power loss. That's a consumer problem. We're looking to be open. We are soliciting feedback and input. We'll put information on the web. We'll put information in public hearings, a chance for people to kind of comment. We're very interested in that breadth.
One of the questions that has come to my mind in connection with the QER is that infrastructure by its nature is an upfront capital investment and a major capital investment. And the sources of capital that we've traditionally looked to in our economy, the federal government itself in terms of major federal shares for highways and other infrastructure investments, and then private investments. And right now, the federal budget doesn't seem like there's a lot of room for major capital investment, and the private economy is still coming out of a major trench. And so I'm wondering what kind of a filter you're putting on the infrastructure analysis in terms of the timing of availability of the adequate capital that it would take to do the infrastructure that your analysis is certain to show we need.
So that's two things about it. The first one is I couldn't agree with you more. This whole notion of the framework and the intersection of finance and capital and investment into this system is going to be pivotal to what outcomes we end up with. But I've been struck in the work we've so far done in discussions I've had with a lot of folks around this community and others, it's not a lack of access to capital, it's choice about where it might move and whether the investment circumstances are attractive or unattractive. What I took in part from this last conversation was utilities could make investments, but there are going to be competition questions about how they manage those, and the rules of the road will dictate which choices they make. That, to me, is a question that we can help articulate, although ultimately the choices will be individual choices and not the government's. I couldn't agree more. There's not going to be massive government intervention here. But our history of government intervention in the power sector is actually a little bit erratic. Right? We had a period in the 1950s where we made massive investment in rural electrification. But since then, it's mostly not been. It's mostly been private actors. It's been some state players. It's been much more localized. There have been regulatory regimes within which they live. There's been assistance programs provided at quite marginal costs in terms of the overall cost of the system. Those are quite small. But how you write the rules and what objectives we as a community articulate and how we put those out to the community will dictate whether an investment goes in one direction or another. I think this report can help frame that in a more constructive fashion. I think we got maybe one more and then that's it. Great. So I think I'll leave you there without that. Hope to be in touch. Thanks very much.